It's now my pleasure to introduce Anna Brower. Anna has been with the ACLU of Utah since 2007, and she's currently the Strategic Communications Manager. Anna was born here in Salt Lake City, and she graduated from West High. Any West High alums in the audience tonight? Woo! Let's hear it. Yes, all right. Anna received her undergraduate degree in journalism from the University of Denver, and she recently completed the Executive Masters of Public Administration program at the University of Utah, a program that I myself just began. So, any MPA grads? Okay, cool. All right. Anna has worked in nonprofit and public sector advocacy communications and fundraising for like a million years, which I imagine any time in fundraising feels like a million years. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Anna.
Thank you. Thanks, Tommy. It's nice to be here. Mychal Denzel Smith is a prolific writer and social commentator. His works appeared in The Guardian, Salon, Ebony, The Griot, The Root, The Huffington Post, Feministing, BuzzFeed, and more. He reports directly from the intersection of race, gender, politics, identity, and power. Oh, there's also hip hop, sneakers, and sports blended into his work. And trust me, it totally works when he does it. Mychal Smith is a contributing writer to The Nation magazine, obviously, a blogger at thenation.com, and a Nobler Journalism Fellow at the Nation Institute. He's appeared on TV, saying words with Melissa Harris Perry of MSNBC, but also on programs like Uprising with Sonali Kahatkar, Left of Black with Mark Anthony Neal, Rembert Explains with Rembert Brown, and on Regina Bradley's Outcasted Conversations. And he's just on the verge of seeing his first book published, called Invisible Man Got the Whole World Watching. Since being asked to give this introduction, I've read many of Mychal's articles and listened to several of his interviews. Obviously, I stalked him on Facebook to write this introduction. And I get the feeling that making people feel comfortable about race is not his top priority. Ending the killing and humiliation and repression and unfair treatment of Black people by government institutions does seem to be a top priority, along with advocating for mental health and reproductive freedom. And talking about these things is not always comfortable. So Mychal observes and reports, but he also contextualizes and personalizes. What he does not do is pull his literary punches. His work reminds us how painfully racist our country still is, no matter how much we want to talk about how far we've come, and how privileged many of us continue to be by a system of white supremacy. I know we're in Utah, and everyone in Utah likes to be nice, but there's just no nice way to say this. Our institutions here are as racist as everywhere else. And we hate talking about it because we think it means we're not nice people, and that is like the worst sin possible for super nice Utah people. But we have to talk about it, or things won't change. In Utah, our statewide population is about 1.3% Black. Our state prison population is about 6.5% Black. Black public school students in Utah get sent to juvenile court when white students get sent to the principal's office. In Salt Lake City, arguably one of Utah's most diverse and progressive cities, arrests of Black men and women occur more than 5 times as often as arrests of white people. And the disparities are similar for Latino, Polynesian, Native American, mixed race, immigrant, and refugee members of our Utah communities. Working with local activists on the school-to-prison pipeline, police brutality, and mass incarceration, I do hear optimism and hope from emerging young leaders of color, but I also hear a lot of rage and pain. And I've noticed that this hot bundle of anger and fear and hurt, specifically about policing and the lack of justice in our justice system, is almost incomprehensible to the majority population in Utah, most of whom have never had a negative interaction with police or any interaction with the rest of the criminal justice system. So there's a tendency in our state for people who are not brutalized by the system to just not believe it's happening to anyone else, and that these other people who say they're experiencing these realities don't really have anything to be mad about. But as Mychal's reporting and writing about race and policing all over the country should warn us, ignoring this swell of hurt and anger in Utah over racial injustice is a terrible idea. And dismissing it as unfounded is incredibly unfair and astoundingly short-sighted. Talking about race and pointing out racism is imperative if we're ever to truly realize a country where, in the language of the ACLU, our constitutional rights are actually a reality for everyone. We can't end racist practices and policies if we don't talk about race. So let's talk about it. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the final, and I believe, inevitably fantastic speaker in this special series, Mr. Mychal Denzel Smith.
Thank you all. Thank you, Anna, for that introduction that I cannot live up to. Thank you to the Salt Lake City Public Library for having me here and conducting this series. Before I get started in earnest, I would like to ask, are there any police officers in the room? Okay, because the last time that I did give a public speech about race and police, there were several police officers in attendance, and one of them threatened me. So I'm just checking, just for my safety. Yeah, I'm also scheduled to speak for like 40 minutes, but I'm certain that I'm gonna get bored of the sound of my own voice before then, so we'll probably open it up for questions before that happens. I don't have to tell you what's happening right now. I think you're all pretty aware of the movement for Black Lives happening in response to police violence, to the killings of mostly young Black people, mostly unarmed, but a response really to the state that we live in, which is a police state, an incarceration state. We are committed to the idea of policing and incarceration as a means of solving our social ills. But I want to start with The Nation magazine, because I think that that's a useful frame for what I'm going to say later. Because The Nation magazine is founded in 1865 by abolitionists. Like, these are people that look at the institution of slavery and see it as an unjust sight. And they don't say, how do we make this fair? They don't say, how do we change the system of slavery in order to be more humane? They say that slavery in itself is an inhumane system, is an unjust system, is founded on inequality, and we must abolish it. We must get rid of it. And I think, over time, obviously in this country, we've had our sort of radical movements. We've had racial justice movements, we've had labor movements, we've had the so-called gay rights movement, women's liberation movement, like whatever mainstream name that gets appropriated to these things. But we've had our radical movements and we've had our radical language, but we're losing that. Like, we have not been in a time of radical thought, of reimagining our systems. We particularly of a left political leaning in the years since what, like Nixon, Carter, like that. I think that's sort of a time period where you can see the left shifting more rightward. It definitely happens with Reagan moving the country right, and then Bill Clinton sort of trying to triangulate, but really that just meant moving to the right. And with that, the ways in which we talk about our problems and then solutions to our problems get shifted to the right. And we get shifted to more and more ideas of conservation of our systems, whether or not they are unjust or not, whether or not they are founded on that inequality, whether or not they are founded on unfairness, whether or not they are inhumane in their very existence. We don't seek to end them. We seek to reform them. We want to make them work better. And I think that that's clearer nowhere, it's no more clear than when we talk about racism, and then we talk about policing, and we talk about incarceration. When we talk about racism in this country, or at least until the past few years, we've not even used the word racism. We use like cute euphemisms like race relations, which is meaningless. Like absolutely, I hate it so much. It's like what Anna was talking about in sort of the niceties. Like as long as we can all be nice to one another, as long as you have a black friend, as long as like our kids, grow up like sharing crayons with one another and they don't see race when it's like, yeah, I'm gonna share my brown crayon with my white friend. It's like great. We say things like that. We take public polls on the progress of racism, or like wonder like who's more affected by racism? Is there reverse racism? All of these things that distract us from the foundation. They distract us from the real conversation about just what real world effects a racist system has on those of us who live on the other side of it, who live on the other side of the oppression. And within that, then when we locate the sites of racism, when we can finally do that, we don't want to end those institutions. We want to reform them. So that's what the conversation is right now, right? We're talking about mass incarceration, so we're talking about prison reform. We're talking about violent policing, abusive policing. We're talking about reforming, because we're still committed to the maintenance of the system. We're not fundamentally opposed to what the system is doing. We want to ensure that the system is able to hide its hand. We want to ensure that the people who have established power, the people who have grabbed power, continue to hold on to that power. And so when we talk about policing, I was in Ferguson recently. I was in Ferguson for the 1-year anniversary of the killing of Michael Brown. And on the day that we're reminiscing on what happened, they shot another young black man, another 18-year-old. And naturally, the anger boiled over and people took to the streets again. There's not a whole lot of media there, so there weren't as many pictures. But if you've seen the pictures from the previous year, you know exactly what it looks like. It looks like that line of police officers in riot gear. It looks like the Humvees. It looks like the shooters on top of them. It looks like the cops standing with military garb and M16s. Only thing they were missing were the dogs. This single thing that was different. And in standing there and standing with the protesters, seeing what happened, seeing the anger boil over, getting hit with they did the tear gas, they did the rubber bullets, they did the snatch and grabs, they did all of that again, as if to like throw it in people's faces, like to say that we did not learn anything and we don't care. And I think that's the bigger thing, is that it's not that they didn't learn anything, it's just they legitimately do not care. But later, I was with a group of friends, colleagues, and we left the site of the protest to go to the police news conference that they were holding about the shooting. And then we went back down to the site of the protest, which is not too far from where Michael Brown was killed. we were looking for a friend, and the only people that we could ask, because the only people down there were the police officers. Now I'm driving, and like we pull up, and there's like a line of police cars, and I'm ready to turn around, like just get out of there. But we do need to like get some type of information on our friend if we could. Young woman in the passenger seat calls the police officer over, asks the right information, and we decide, he's just lost his phone. That's all that's happened. He's not in police custody. But then, she's a journalist. I'm technically a journalist. We're asking questions. What happened tonight? What was the shooting? And the police officer at this point has looked around the entire car, ascertained that there are 4 black people in this car. And before he answers the question, I kid you not, he says, "Wait, let me turn this off." And the camera that is supposed to be our thing, like that's supposed to be the solve. That's supposed to be our accountability. That's supposed to be what helps to fix this. He turned it off right in front of us and drew attention to the fact that he was turning it off, and no longer was he recording this conversation, and no longer was what was happening to us being recorded. A car full of black people, police officer, and he's turning the camera off. So when we talk about reforms, I'm just like, what? What do you want? Like the one thing that you're offering here, they turn it off at will. They turn it off when they don't want you to see anything. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about reforms being inadequate. That does not fundamentally get at the root of what policing is about. I think that's what bothers me a lot about the language. And I said this to one of the Democratic presidential candidates in a closed-door meeting with him. I told him, you use these words, fixing the relationship between police and the communities. Fixing it to what? This is what it has always been. It's not you're not returning to anything. You're not like you are trying to impose new rules on a system that is resistant to that, because it is fundamentally goes against what the achievement is, what the goal is. The system is not broken. And I think that we have to really wrestle with that. The system is not broken. It is working exactly the way that it is meant to work. And that is to reinforce inequality. And it reinforces inequality along lines of race, along lines of gender, along lines of class, along lines of sexual orientation, by the ways in which we criminalize behaviors. We criminalize behaviors and we criminalize people. We have this class of things that we call crimes, and I think that there are some things in there that we all can agree are heinous things that we would like to see rid from our society. Like, we don't want to see anyone killed. We don't want to see anyone raped. But we've then created a whole class of things that we're arresting people for, and we're putting them in jail for behaviors that do not need to be criminalized, that even if we agree to some extent that they do pose a problem, the solution is not to arrest people and lock them away in cages. We can go down the line and think things like, obviously the war on drugs, right? Like, we're talking about trying to end the war on drugs because it failed. No, it did exactly what it was meant to do. It locked up a lot of black and brown poor people. That's exactly what it was supposed to do. It was supposed to feed the system. The roots of the illegality of drugs is racist. Like, opium, weed, these things are illegal in our country, not because they're harmful. It's because the prevailing ideology was that when black people and Mexicans get these drugs in their system, they become violent and rapist. And they're violent towards white people, and we need to protect ourselves from that. So here's a convenient way to lock them up. We've criminalized so many different, we go back to Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, and we go back to convict leasing and the black codes. They criminalized, this was something that was on the books, but was never enforced. They criminalized essentially not having a job. It's vagrancy. You couldn't produce evidence that you were employed, you were arrested. You were put on a chain gang, essentially, sent back to the same plantations that were just shut down because of the end of the Civil War. It was illegal to play dice in the street. Now, why is this illegal? Why do we need to lock people away for this? And then we can trace it right on down to things like, in certain places, not New Orleans, but like public drinking, you know? Why are we locking people away? Why are we arresting people, putting them in jail cells for this? What does that solve? We say quality of life, but we talk about like quality of life crimes, but who is being harmed? Who's actually being harmed in this situation? Like, is it someone for having to witness a drunken person? Like, how many of us have not seen a drunken person? But now you're arresting this person. And it's the things like sleeping outside that become illegal. So now you're criminalizing homelessness, right? Now we call the police to deal with people who have severe mental illnesses when they're manic, or when, and they're not trained to do, they're not social workers, they're not therapists, they're not mental health professionals, they don't know what to do. The only thing police know how to do is shoot people and arrest them. That's their job. And we're expecting them to do so much more. We foment social decay and then ask the police to come in and fix it. And it's outside of their purview. But we come to rely on the police because the police are state actors of violence. And what we want, or what we've established, is that we want protection from the threat. And the threat looks very specific. The threat has been established through our pop culture, through our laws, through just our history. We know what the threat looks like. The threat looks like me. And so when you're starting there, look at just the roots of the police themselves. And we're talking about like the 1800s. We're still like North and South states. In the North, the police get their roots in quelling uprisings, urban uprisings that are in part due to labor movement. So the whole idea is to prevent freedom of speech for people trying to fight for the rights of laborers. In the South, police have their start with slave catchers. That's the origin. They've always been about protecting property and serving those who have it. And in some of those instances, the property was black people. So this is where we start with the police. We're not going back to anything. Now, there comes a time when immigrant labor starts to find work in the police force, right? So like Irish and Italians like sort of become police officers as a means of getting into a middle-class lifestyle, and that's a noble profession that's offered to like white immigrants. And we then start to establish this heroic narrative about the police and about who the police are and what the police do for us. But what they've always done and what they continue to do and what the trajectory continues to be is to reinforce the inequality that is the foundation of American society. I was telling you the story about being in Ferguson, and when that, now one of the things is we talk about militarization, and the optics are awful. I walked past the M16s, and it's frightening. But that's not new. One, it's not new, and two, they don't need it to accomplish what they want to. The roots of that are not recent. That's SWAT. That's LA responding to the Watts uprisings and establishing SWAT teams. This special, tactical force that's going to be able to handle these urban terrains when the darkies get out of order. And then to justify the existence of SWAT, you start using it for more things. As we establish more wars, we start a war on drugs, we start a war on crime. Oh, we found a place to use SWAT again. So we expand SWAT. And we give them more money, more resources to buy more toys. They have the battering rams, they have the tanks, they have the helicopters, all of that. They already looked like military. And then in the 80s, what happens? They use all of that to accomplish what they're trying to accomplish in the war on drugs. And it expands in the 90s. And then 9/11 happens, and then we decide we're gonna fight another war, and we're gonna fight a war on terrorism. And we're not just gonna fight it over there, we're gonna fight it over here too. And who's gonna fight it for us? Our police officers are gonna fight it. So now they need more toys. They need more weapons of mass destruction. And what is the pretext for that? Again, it's a racialized threat. Again, we see the Arab person now as a threat, someone who's Muslim, who looks Muslim. So the foundation of all of this is identifying threats and then trying to eliminate them. It's trying to ensure that people of those oppressed groups know that they are second-class citizens. Is to strike fear in us. Michael Brown's body was not left there for 4.5 hours because the police were too lazy to get him out the street or because they didn't know what the protocol should be. Michael Brown's body was left there as a message. This happens to you. You step out of your place and this is what you get. It's the same thing from lynchings on down to this. It's left there for the community to understand. That's what the police do every day in these communities, in the everyday harassment, the everyday stop and frisk, the everyday jump outs, the everyday questionings. And my friend was just he was walking down the street in his Brooklyn neighborhood and a police officer asked him, "Are you on parole or probation?" Did not approach him on any, that was the first question that he asked. And then I'm supposed to turn to these people when something bad happens, right? But again, protect and serve who? Because when Trayvon Martin was shot, how long did it take them to decide under the laws that they are sworn to uphold that George Zimmerman deserved to be arrested? Now, how long would it have taken them if Trayvon Martin was white? Who are they serving? Who are they protecting? Because it's not me, and it's not my community. And this is where it starts to get tricky, right? Because, the rejoinder every time you start talking about police violence, and I get so sick of it. But what about black on black violence? Yes, what about it? You seem to only care when I'm trying to talk about white supremacy and the police and the ways in which we are talking about the continued violent oppression of our communities. But yes, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the fact that in our communities, every day, young black men are being killed. Because that's all anyone means when they're talking about black on black violence, right? Like, this is how I know people are not genuine about this, like, other than just being racist. Is that the only violence that they're talking about when they talk about black on black violence has to do with young black men shooting one another. No one, when they say black on black violence, is talking about rape, sexual assault, particularly the lives of black trans women. No one's interested in having that discussion, because again, what we do when we do that is we indict more people and we indict a larger system. But going back to just the black male violence that people want us to talk about and want us to be concerned about. You say you don't march for that. Well, yes, people do, and you're not there. You don't show up when those protests happen, when people are trying to fix their communities. 2, black people want to call the police too. Black people would like to call the police when they get robbed. Black people would like to call the police when their loved ones get shot and killed. Black women would like to call the police when they are assaulted. You know why no one does it? Because when the police show up, who's the ones who get harassed? No one gets treated like a victim. Everyone gets treated like a threat. I was speaking to some kids. My friend works at this foundation for specifically young black people who have been in the system, have been caught up in violence and things, and trying to just talk about that, talk through trauma, talk through healing. And when I went to speak to them, it was about a month after one of their friends had been killed. So they were still very much in the grieving. And in talking to them, what they said to me was that, yeah, the police have been here. They ask questions, but then every time they come back, they ask the same questions. It doesn't feel like they're doing anything. It feels like they're leaving it up to us. So if you're genuinely interested in ending so-called black on black violence, and your means through which you would like to see this, like, that we're supposed to get justice is through the police and through the court system, why is it that when someone kills a black person, no matter what race they are, no one gets arrested? You don't care, because the threat's being eliminated anyway. But back to sort of just talking about the police a little bit. I didn't realize I was talking this long. But the police are offered up to us as the only means through which we can establish safety. And that's what people want more than anything when we're talking about the violence that they experience in their communities. People want to feel safe. No one wants to live next to who they've identified as the criminal. No one wants to hear the gunshots. That no one should have to grow up like that. But And there's a new book out called Black Silent Majority that sort of indicts black politicians and leaders in black community alongside of the law and order politicians of the Nixon and on down to Reagan and Clinton eras for also calling for the increased police presence, the increased criminality, the increased incarceration. And that's true. It's true, because people have been seeking ways to rescue their communities from the violence that exists there. Violence typically born out of other systems, violence born out of poverty, violence born out of hopelessness. But in the immediate sense, yes, arrest them so that we don't have to deal with them anymore, right? Like, that's just what we do. But in that, my response to that, though, is what other option were people given? Because fighting for the things that would actually eliminate the violence and the drugs before that era, like the public investment, right? Getting things that white people got during the New Deal that black people were shut out of. Because it's funny how you move from that sort of like New Deal into Great Society era. And one of my favorite things is, John F. Kennedy, when he was campaigning for president, like went to Appalachia, where in Virginia, so very poor rural white area. And he's just so distraught over what he sees that when he becomes president, one of the first things that he does is to implement the food stamp program, like because he wants so desperately for that aid to go to white Appalachians. Now, then what we have is the civil rights movement fighting for equality, right? And right around the time when public assistance finally starts trickling into the black community, then we have the emergence of the welfare queen. Then Reagan decides that it's over, that we shouldn't be helping people. But that's what I mean in terms of like the structural things that create the violence in the first place we're not examining. And then the only offer of support that these communities get is police, is prisons. That's the only investment that we're willing to make with this sort of like robust, excited, enthusiastic, and monetary investment in solving our social ills, particularly when it comes to black and brown and poor communities, is to lock them up. So what else are we supposed to ask for if no one's going to fund things that actually prevent the violence? So this, then, is where I get in trouble and where I got in trouble and where I got threatened. Because it goes back to the abolitionist framework of understanding what we need to do. And I am very firmly a believer in the abolition of prisons and the abolition of police. Literally the first time anyone has ever applauded that. And so the first question, I tell you, I know the first question that anyone ever has when I ask, so what do you want to replace them with? Nothing. I don't want to replace them with anything. But what I mean when I say, looking at it with an abolitionist framework, is that when you locate police and prisons as sites of injustice, they themselves are inherently unjust and cannot be used to establish a just world, then you ask the question, how do we do that without the police? How do we get to safety without using the police and prisons? How do we get to economic justice without using police and prisons? How do we get to gender justice without using police and prisons? How do we make it so we don't have so many women ending up in prison for self-defense because of their abusive partners, because they either shot at or shot their abusive partners? What would it mean for us to rethink, oh, she should have called the police? What would it mean for us to rethink a world where the police don't exist? How do we solve her problem of being abused, right? Like that gets us into all kinds of stuff about redefining masculinity. It gets us into talking about guns and using violence as a means of domination and coercion. And that completely upends the system that we have. That upends the system of patriarchy. Like male domination no longer holds weight if we talk about those things, right? How do we establish that we don't want people shooting each other over drug sales? How do we think about doing that without police and prisons as a fail-safe for us to just not deal with the problem? We don't want people shooting each other over drugs. You know, we've been here before. Like, we did the prohibition thing. We found out what happened. We're just going through it again for a much longer time and banging our heads against the walls as if to say we don't know what to do. We know exactly what to do. But how do we rethink that? How do we rethink people who are addicted to drugs and how to treat them outside of an arrest and in prison context? How do we treat it as a public health issue? How do we just acknowledge that most people use drugs recreationally and we don't need to lock them up for it? This is what these are the questions that an abolitionist framework will get us to answer. I don't know what's on the other side of that. I really can't tell you. But what I can tell you is that if we do the work of establishing a society built on inequality equality at its foundation, built on equality and justice at its foundation, justice meaning the affirmation of one's life, not the retribution that comes at the end of it. If we start there, we reduce so many of the problems that we're trying to fix with the police and with the prisons, that on the other side of that, if we do find a need for an armed police force, if we get it right, and yet somehow the new problems that arise here require people that walk around with guns on the street, we can reimagine then what their actual role should be. And it won't be one of domination, of violence, of coercion, of reinforcement of a status quo that is inherently unequal. But for me, I don't see a role for them in that world, but I can't say for sure. And this is what I tell people when they like, look, if we establish a world in which we decriminalize drugs, we start treating people for mental illness, we treat drugs as a health crisis, we deconstruct gender roles, and we talk about violence against women, and we talk about autonomy, and we talk about how to respect and acknowledge the existence of trans people, and we don't have violence against people based on sexual identity, and we teach at a young age about nonviolent means of mediating conflict. Like, if we start doing all of that and more, like if we have an economic system that like fundamentally cares for all of us with like, I don't know, stuff like universal basic income, universal health care, like free education, all of these things, like if we can establish that world first, and then a crackhead still comes to your door and robs you of your Blu-ray player, I will call the police for you. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Mychal. So if you'll just raise your hand if you have a question, we'll come bring a microphone to you.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm not used to microphones. I just want to know where black police, both male and female, fit into your speech.
They're police.
Black police.
They're police. There's no distinction to be drawn. And this is another thing that sort of gets floated out there as like we need more diversity within the police ranks. Black police shoot black people too. It's a function of the job, right? Like, and the only way in which you're going to challenge that, whether you are black, white, or whatever, within that system, is to be derelict in your duty. Like changing the face of oppression doesn't change the oppression.
So I would just like some clarification on the abolishment of the prisons in relation to seeing justice as an affirmation for life versus a punishment at the end. So if somebody rapes a woman, then, my understanding from what you stated that, she should be free to defend herself by any means necessary without being thrown in jail. And I happen to actually agree with that. But what if somebody is, there's a lot of pedophiles out there, and, what do we do with those types of people that do those types of heinous crimes, rapes and pedophilia and so forth, and without a place to put them in the meantime? I don't see how that's possible. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So this is the difficult part about like talking about prison abolition, is because we have housed a lot of people in there who have committed incredibly heinous acts, right? And people do this. It happens. One, the world I'm talking about in which prisons do not exist, again, the foundation is justice and equality before we get to the idea of someone being raped. You see what I'm saying? Like we're trying to prevent the rape from happening in the first place, right? So that's the first point that I'm trying to make. But also, yes, we cannot prevent every bad thing from happening, right? So what do we do with the actors? And it's a hard question to answer. It simply is, because we could then replicate the prison, right? We could say, well, we're only going to house certain people for what they do, and then prison just becomes reinscribed into our society. We could, in the case of like pedophilia, something like that, look at it as mental illness and treatment. And obviously we have to then, it's the care for the victims of this. I think that for me is really the center, is what is it that the people who have been victimized actually need? What support do they need in our society? Does locking a person away solve the issue? We're talking about more here restorative justice, actually sitting down, instead of establishing, here are the laws, here's the penalties. We're looking at individually, what does that person need in terms of support from our community? And that's going to vary. And look, it's tough to wrap your mind around, because, and I'm not without my contradictions here. I'm not gonna sit up here and try to be pure and righteous about this, right? Because no, I've lost people to gun violence. I can run down the list of women in my family who've been abused by partners, it's hard to separate out the emotion that you feel for people experiencing that thing, and then looking forward to what a world built on justice and the needs of the victimized actually look like. Because like where we are now is like, I want that person locked up because that's what's available. So it will take some imagination. But what I propose in talking about the abolition of prison is that we can't imagine that with the prison available to us.
Show of hands. Let's see, I'm gonna come over here actually. We never get questions from over here, so it's kind of
Hi. When you had that meeting with the presidential candidate,
Yeah.
can you go over kind of what was discussed and a little bit how it went?
I'm not gonna say who it was because technically I'm not supposed to even talk about it. But someone came to New York City and a bunch of black journalists and activists sat down with him and talked to him about his platform and talked to him about what the movement is demanding, talked about how he could establish himself as a viable candidate. And then he said, "White lives matter." Yeah.
I was wondering how you imagine technology could help or hinder in getting to your ideal of no police and no prisons.
I imagine that someone smarter than me should answer that question. No, I mean, look, that's part of it. Like, what's 80% of a police officer's job is mostly like bureaucratic stuff that has to do with paperwork, that has to do with fines and fees and all of that type of stuff. Why couldn't that be electronic? You know, I don't know. I've not thought about that question too much, but if you are more technologically inclined than I am, that's what you should start working on.
Yes, brother, over here. From one black person to another.
Yes, sir.
You know, I go to my community, right, and I try to talk about this stuff, you know what I mean, saying, yo, we gotta talk about this. Like, we have bodies, how many bodies we lost? You know, I know I got a lot of friends that have been dropped myself. But I realize, you know, we're not promoting it in the mainstream, you know. It's the thug mentality, I think, that's being promoted. I may be wrong, but I see not I feel like we trade a Malcolm X for a Soldier Boy, you dig? And I just feel like, how do you, when you go to your community, you know, because I'm having a hard time up here, brother, like trying to address my brothers and sisters about this. And I'm not trying to say just black people, but just anybody who ain't trying to hear it. There's like, oh man, another Negro that's just trying to start problems and not, just go, pretty much they're telling me stay in your lane, go back to cooling and hollering. And so how would you go back to your community and get them uplifted? Because I'm like, what is it? Like, you mean, how many times a person gotta get shot for someone to be like, look, it's on. You know, we gotta like change the law or do something.
I don't know who you talking to, bro. It's happening. The movement is moving. People are fed up. And I don't think we traded in Malcolm X for Soldier Boy. You know, they killed Malcolm. That's what happened. And also, I just wouldn't draw a line between those two. I think we like traded Frankie Lyman for Soldier Boy. Like that's more apt. I think, you know, what does it take for people to stand up and fight for their rights? The tipping point recently was Trayvon Martin. That's what sparked this new movement. I don't think that, like, you need somebody to go into a community and like rile them up, and we need people to go into communities and organize. People to organize the anger that already exists there, to build bases of political power. But people know. Our people know. They know what the injustice is. They live it every single day. You don't have to tell them what it is. And everyone gets to that point at different times. I mean, look, like, we can talk about like the heyday, the civil rights movement, 50s and 60s, right? Only 12% of the black population participated. So the idea that we're somehow more apathetic or something, that we've like decided to like, no, it was people staying at home listening to their Motown records then. And people going, y'all Negroes crazy. And then there was people that just went to work every day because somebody's got to survive. Somebody's got to survive to build the new world. You know, it's a dangerous occupation trying to get out there and fight for your freedom.
Who are the two most powerful groups in our society today? The police and the court system. What would happen if the flow of drugs into this country stopped? What would they do for a living? There are millions of narcotics cops and judges in this country that make their living. They pay off their house mortgages and they send their kids to school because they're busting predominantly African American and Latino people in our society and sending them to prison, not to mention the prison industrial complex.
Right on.
Thank you. I came in a little bit late, I can't quite remember, but I got kind of two comments. First, to respond to something. I moved out, I'm from New Orleans, grew up in New Orleans, and I moved to Salt Lake City in 1996 to pursue a PhD in chemistry. I ended up getting a master's. When I moved out here, I had 3 children. My daughter at the time, she was 8 years old. No, yeah, she was 8. I had a son who was 1, and my youngest son was actually born here. And I basically came out here kind of with the idea, I'm gonna get my degree, then I'm gonna go back to somewhere more quote-unquote cultural, right? Mm-hmm. And then kind of, as you said, to help my community and for them to understand and see, wow, this is a guy with chemistry, blah, blah, blah. But in the context of starting to live here, one of the things that I recognized and realized was, number one, people are people, and as you said, people want pretty much the same thing, to live in a neighborhood that's safe and quiet, or, you know, to love and be loved, to have a little bit of cash to go out and have a little bit of fun, or whatever the case may be. As my sons got older, I had friends, I would talk to them and they would ask me, when are you coming back to New Orleans? And I would be like, I'm not, you know. And they would kind of ask me incredulously, why, you know? And I'm like, because when my sons walk out the door, they don't have to look left for a drug dealer or right for a gangbanger. And I kind of had to do that through high school. And there were places or points in my life when I was like, I could have been killed, stray bullet, whatever. New Orleans is kind of that kind of an atmosphere. So that was comment number one. Comment number two, in regards to how do you uplift your community, that has been an ongoing struggle, if you will. But one of the things that I had a friend, we would talk about this stuff, and he's older than I am, about 50 years old now, I'm 44. And we were listening to Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Yeah. And kind of went on and he said, you know, at some point you got to take your revolutions where you can get them. I was 20-something at the time, probably 24, didn't really understand what he meant until sometime this year when I realized a revolution, you know, Malcolm X would be the quintessential guy. If you wanted to start a revolution, he was the one to be leading it. You know, and at a certain point, as we said, he got killed and life went on. And as you said, people went home listening to the Temptations and stuff like that. And that's just human nature. But what to get to my point, what I realized was you got to take your revolutions where you can get them. Meant to me was whenever you come across a person who either has the same ideology or wants to develop him or herself into a better person, I felt it was my obligation to give that person, regardless of race or sex or whatever the case may be, I thought it was my obligation to tell that person, hey, this is how I got here, or this is the information I gained. Take it and do as you want with it, and figure out how you're going to make the next person or the next, you know, it might just be your kids, you know, and it's 2 or 3, 6 degrees of separation, whenever.
Yeah.
But that's my idea. Sorry.
Yeah, that's sort of a each one teach one sort of philosophy, but you know, at the end of that, the system is still in place. You know, like we can uplift and empower like individuals all we would like, but you know, even even the man who sits atop of the American empire is not safe from racism. You know, he's not protected. So what do we do with that information? What do we do with like literally the guardian of American empire who's shown that he will do what it takes to maintain that empire in the name of the United States of America, and they still walk around with signs like witch doctors and want to see his birth certificate and yell at him, you lie, and things like that. I mean, that's just how deep-seated this is. And that's just, that's what I'm, like, when we're talking about uprooting that, it is addressing the system as it has been founded, and it is founded on white supremacy. And then it is saying, we don't want that system anymore, let's establish a new one. And I guess to your first point, I mean, obviously, like, raise your kids the way you see fit to raise your children. I don't have any. I'm not going to tell anybody how to do it. But I guess like that fear is real, like in communities where like that have designated high crime communities and where it's like gangbangers and drug dealers and things like that. I mean, my first challenge would just be like, I mean, if drugs weren't illegal, he would just be a businessman. Like, you know, like, he would just have a business. And that's where the violence comes from. We know this, right? Like, we know this because what happens is, like, if I own a store, like, and someone robs me, I can call the police. You know why I call the police? Because the police are empowered by the state to use violence on my behalf. Now, if I am in an illegal trade, I can't call the police to get my product or my money back. But violence still rules the day. So who's supposed to do it? This is where the violence comes from, like the illegality of it. Now, then you talk about like gangbangers and things, and I just would we have a very particular understanding of who that is. Like, it's a young black man in America. Like, that's mostly the image that comes up, right? I would just ask us to reframe our understanding of black male life in America to say, like, what brings those boys to that point that they're willing to put their lives on the line for essentially nothing? I would, as someone like who has experienced, post-traumatic stress, depression, survivor's guilt, all of these things, I would say that those boys are suicidal. They don't want to kill themselves, like, do it, but they are putting themselves in dangerous situations with the idea that I have no hope. So how did they get to that point? Why didn't we care for them before they got to that point? And why are we writing them off now? I think
We have time for one more question.
One more question.
So yeah, we've already got a mic up there.
All right.
But we'll continue the conversation after, so please join us.
I'm wondering what your thoughts are about voter turnout. I mean, I think about it every once in a while, and even in a presidential year, I don't think we get more than about 50% at the best. And it seems to me that most of the people who could vote that don't vote are underprivileged, poor, blacks, Latinos. And I can understand, they're feeling like, what's the point? Because I often feel that way myself, but I vote anyway. So I just imagine a world where all of a sudden, pretty much everybody who can legally vote votes. It seems to me that would create a tidal wave of change.
maybe.
Maybe, yeah.
Maybe.
Well,
That's the answer to your, it's maybe. Like I want to quote the great philosopher Waka Flocka Flame and say, voting good, voting is not enough. What we have to have in order to produce the politicians worth voting for is movements in the streets to push them to our demands, push them to rethink society. Because what we have now, we have the politicians we deserve. And until that moment happens in which a critical mass, like my brother was talking about, it's like in the streets and demanding. Now, it doesn't have to be all of us. We don't all have to be in the streets. Someone has to survive to build the new world. And they're going to get some of us. But until we are talking about building the movements that produce the politicians worth voting for, voting good, but it's not enough.